What we're looking at here is a Sumerian tablet that actually shows the tree of life, flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side.
Around 4000 BCE, in the fertile lands of southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, communities began gathering between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. No exact hour survives from this distant period, but the transformation that followed would eventually reshape human history. Over the centuries, small settlements expanded into organized communities, and cities such as Eridu, Uruk, and Ur emerged from the surrounding landscape. The people who built them would become known as the Sumerians, creating one of the earliest urban civilizations known to archaeology. Their world was built largely from mud, but from that humble material they would create buildings, vessels, administrative records, and eventually something even more powerful, a way to preserve human memory. What happened in this region would eventually leave behind thousands of tablets containing fragments of a civilization that had been silent for millennia. By around 3400 BCE, at the growing city of Uruk, a revolutionary development began to transform how information was preserved. Sumerian administrators started pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, creating the writing system we now call cuneiform. At first, these marks were practical, recording grain, livestock, workers, goods, taxes, and transactions needed to manage increasingly complex cities. But the system gradually expanded far beyond accounting, allowing scribes to preserve royal decrees, contracts, religious rituals, poetry, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, and stories. For the first time, human thoughts and information could survive long after the person who created them had disappeared. A scribe could press a message into clay, allow it to harden, and unknowingly create a record capable of surviving thousands of years. The Sumerians had not simply invented writing, they had created a physical memory that could outlive entire civilizations. As the third millennium BCE unfolded, Sumerian scribes developed increasingly sophisticated mathematical and administrative systems, including a sexagesimal or base 60 system that would leave a remarkable legacy. Their calculations were used for measuring quantities, land, time, and astronomical observations, while the same numerical tradition eventually influenced concepts that remain familiar today. 60 seconds make a minute, 60 minutes make an hour, and a circle contains 360 degrees, connections that ultimately trace back through the mathematical traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. At the same time, scribes were recording observations of the moon, planets, stars, seasons, and unusual celestial events. Other tablets preserved medical recipes, descriptions of injuries, religious ceremonies, and rituals associated with healing. What appeared at first to be ordinary administrative paperwork was gradually revealing a civilization that had developed complex systems for mathematics, medicine, religion, government, and the systematic observation of nature. Then, the centuries passed, kingdoms rose and collapsed, cities were destroyed and rebuilt, and the Sumerian language eventually disappeared from everyday speech. The clay tablets remained, buried beneath ancient settlements, temples, archives, and collapsed buildings, but the people of later ages could no longer understand the strange wedge-shaped symbols covering their surfaces. Thousands of years passed, while the writing remained silent, sometimes broken into fragments and sometimes buried beneath layers of soil. When archaeologists finally began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th century, they uncovered enormous collections of tablets and inscriptions. Scholars slowly reconstructed the ancient languages by comparing texts and studying multilingual inscriptions, eventually learning how to read cuneiform once again. Suddenly, stories that had been silent since antiquity began returning to the world, revealing the voices of people who had lived thousands of years before modern civilization. But reading those tablets was never simple because cuneiform was not a straightforward alphabet, and individual signs could carry different sounds or meanings depending on context. A damaged tablet could remove an entire section of a sentence, while unfamiliar vocabulary, changing dialects, scribal traditions, and poetic expressions could make even complete passages difficult to interpret. A single story might be scattered across several broken tablets discovered in completely different locations, sometimes written centuries apart. Scholars therefore had to reconstruct ancient texts, almost like detectives assembling evidence from fragments of a forgotten crime scene. For generations, only a relatively small number of specialists possessed the training required to read these languages at the highest level. Thousands of tablets remained untranslated, meaning that enormous portions of Mesopotamian history were effectively locked inside museums and archaeological storage rooms. That began to change in the 21st century as archaeology entered the digital age. Researchers started creating high-resolution photographs, digital models, databases, and scans of ancient tablets, allowing fragile objects to be examined without constant physical handling. Machine learning then introduced an entirely new possibility. Computers could compare enormous numbers of signs, fragments, words, and linguistic patterns at speeds impossible for a human researcher. In Munich and other research centers, computational methods were used to help reconstruct damaged tablets and identify connections between fragments that might otherwise remain separated. Instead of searching through thousands of tablets one by one, researchers could allow algorithms to identify similarities and possible matches across enormous collections. The world's oldest written archives were suddenly becoming a gigantic digital puzzle, and AI was becoming one of the newest tools available for solving it. By 2023, researchers at institutions including Tel Aviv University and Ariel University were experimenting with artificial intelligence to assist with the translation of Akkadian cuneiform into English. The technology could identify linguistic patterns, generate possible translations, compare repeated expressions, and help researchers work through material that previously required enormous amounts of time. It did not eliminate the need for human experts, because ancient languages are filled with ambiguity and historical context that machines can misunderstand. But the speed was transformative, allowing researchers to process material far faster than traditional methods alone. Texts that might once have required years of painstaking work could potentially be analyzed much more quickly, giving scholars new ways to search for recurring themes and forgotten connections. For the first time, artificial intelligence was beginning to act as a kind of computational assistant for the world's oldest surviving written records. As these tools improved, researchers began examining the astronomical material preserved inside Mesopotamian tablets with even greater attention. The ancient scribes had carefully recorded lunar movements, planetary appearances, eclipses, seasonal changes, and other celestial observations over long periods. These records demonstrate that Mesopotamian scholars were systematic observers of the sky, building traditions of astronomical knowledge that were passed from one generation of scribes to another. Some modern interpretations have pushed these observations much further, suggesting that the Sumerians understood enormous cosmic cycles or even Earth's precession thousands of years before modern astronomy. However, the evidence requires careful interpretation because ancient astronomical observations should not automatically be treated as modern scientific theories. What can be established is already remarkable. People living thousands of years ago were watching the heavens carefully, recording what they saw, and preserving those observations in writing for future generations. The medical tablets tell another part of the story. Ancient Mesopotamian healers recorded symptoms, injuries, plants, preparations, rituals, and methods for treating different conditions, sometimes combining practical observations with religious explanations. These texts reveal that ancient healers paid close attention to the human body and attempted to organize their knowledge into repeatable practices. Later interpretations have sometimes described these passages as evidence of antiseptics, advanced surgery, genetic knowledge, or even modern medical diagnostics. But those claims must be separated from what the texts actually demonstrate. The tablets provide genuine evidence of organized ancient medicine, but they do not prove that Sumerians possessed modern genetics or laboratory science. Their real significance may be even more interesting. They show how early societies attempted to understand disease, injury, reproduction, and the human body long before modern medicine existed. Then came another artifact that would become deeply connected to the mystery of ancient technology: the object commonly called the Baghdad Battery. Discovered in Iraq and generally dated to the Parthian or Sasanian period, thousands of years after the earliest Sumerian writing, the artifact consists of a ceramic vessel associated with a metal cylinder and rod. Some researchers proposed that, when filled with an acidic liquid, it might have produced a weak electrical current, while others argued that there is not enough evidence to establish that electricity was its intended purpose. Most importantly, the object cannot be used as direct evidence that Sumerians were experimenting with electricity thousands of years earlier, because it belongs to a much later historical period. Yet the artifact became a powerful symbol of the broader mystery surrounding ancient technology. It raised a fascinating question: how many ancient technologies have been misunderstood simply because the original written instructions, practical knowledge, or cultural context disappeared? The tablets also preserved stories of enormous disasters, including floods, droughts, famine, warfare, and the collapse of kingdoms. Centuries later, modern archaeology and climate science began finding evidence that some of these disasters corresponded with real environmental changes. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the region experienced severe climatic disruption associated with what researchers call the 4.2 kiloyear event. The Akkadian Empire also declined during roughly this broad period, while archaeological evidence indicates that drought, resource pressure, political instability, and migration affected communities across the region. Ancient scribes described catastrophe through images of darkness, ruined lands, disrupted rivers, and divine anger, while modern scientists investigate the same period through sediments, tree rings, archaeological layers, and climate records. The comparison does not prove that every ancient description represents a literal scientific observation, but it shows that behind some ancient myths may be memories of genuine environmental disasters. And then the story moves from archaeology into mythology, where one of the most controversial names in ancient Mesopotamian history appears: the Anunnaki. In ancient Mesopotamian religion, the Anunnaki were a group of deities whose roles and identities changed across different periods and traditions. They were not originally described as extraterrestrial visitors from another planet, but during the 20th century, modern writers transformed them into something very different. Zecharia Sitchin became especially famous for arguing that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a distant planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago. According to his interpretation, they came to extract Earth's resources and eventually created or genetically modified humans to serve as a workforce. The theory became enormously popular, but mainstream Assyriologists reject it because Sitchin's translations and interpretations do not correspond with established readings of the ancient languages. The ancient texts themselves tell a different story, but one that is still extraordinary. In works such as the Atrahasis epic, humans are created by divine beings to perform labor and maintain the world established by the gods. These stories describe creation through clay, divine substances, blood, and other symbolic elements, creating narratives that later readers sometimes compare with modern ideas about genetic engineering. Yet, the original texts belong to a religious world in which gods, humans, nature, labor, death, and cosmic order were deeply interconnected. They do not provide scientific evidence that extraterrestrial beings engineered modern humans. Still, the parallels are intriguing enough to explain why ancient astronaut theories became so popular. Once modern readers encounter descriptions of divine creation, mysterious substances, specialized vessels, sealed spaces, and supernatural beings, it becomes tempting to reinterpret ancient religious language through the vocabulary of modern technology. Now, artificial intelligence is bringing these ancient passages into the spotlight again. Modern systems can compare thousands of texts, identify repeated expressions, reconstruct damaged passages, and highlight unusual words or phrases that deserve closer examination. A term that appears ordinary in one context may have a completely different meaning in another, and AI can help researchers detect these patterns across enormous collections. Some modern interpretations have claimed that words, such as the Sumerian concept of me, describe technological objects, energy systems, or advanced devices, while other interpretations understand them as divine powers, cultural institutions, or abstract concepts. This is exactly where the mystery becomes dangerous if evidence and speculation are mixed together. AI can reveal patterns hidden in enormous amounts of text, but it cannot automatically prove that an ancient metaphor describes a machine, a spacecraft, or a piece of lost technology. And that brings the story back to the original mystery, the writing itself. For thousands of years, some of these marks were never seen by anyone except the ancient scribes who originally pressed them into wet clay. Their cities disappeared, their languages fell silent, their temples collapsed, and their descendants eventually forgot how to read the writing. Yet the tablets survived, because hardened clay can be remarkably durable, preserving tiny impressions long after buildings, kingdoms, and entire cultures have vanished. Today, archaeologists, linguists, historians, imaging specialists, and AI researchers are looking at those same marks again, attempting to reconstruct what their creators actually meant. The deeper they go, the more complicated the picture becomes, because some discoveries reveal genuine sophistication, while others remain uncertain or heavily distorted by modern speculation. So perhaps the greatest discovery is not evidence of ancient astronauts, genetic laboratories, or impossible machines. Perhaps it is the realization that the earliest civilizations were already recording the world around them with astonishing determination. They watched the stars, measured time, organized cities, treated injuries, recorded disasters, created myths, and preserved their understanding of existence in clay. Now, thousands of years later, technology is allowing us to examine those records at a scale the original scribes could never have imagined. Somewhere among the broken fragments may still be another tablet, another astronomical observation, another forgotten medical recipe, or another story waiting to be reconstructed. And when that hidden writing finally becomes readable, we may not discover the impossible, but we may discover something just as powerful. How much humanity already knew before history learned to remember itself. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian scribes were preserving stories that attempted to answer one of humanity's oldest questions: where did people come from? Among the most important surviving traditions were the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis, texts that described creation through the actions of powerful gods. In these stories, humanity was not presented as a random accident, but as part of a divine order in which humans had a specific purpose. The Atrahasis tradition describes a rebellion among the lesser gods, often identified as the Igigi, who were exhausted by the labor demanded of them. According to the myth, the gods eventually decided that a new creature should be created to take over the work, transforming the story into one about labor, responsibility, and divine authority. Thousands of years later, modern readers would look at those passages and see something very different, a possible ancient story about the deliberate creation of humanity. The creation itself was described through a mixture of clay and divine substances, with the gods shaping humanity according to a supernatural process rather than a natural one. Later interpretations sometimes connect this material with the idea of an engineered human being, but the ancient writers were speaking through religious symbolism rather than modern biology. The name Adamu also became a major point of fascination because it resembles the word Adam found in later Semitic religious traditions. That similarity has encouraged generations of popular writers to suggest that the Sumerian traditions influenced later stories about the creation of humanity. But resemblance does not automatically establish a direct historical connection, and scholars continue to examine the linguistic and cultural relationships between these traditions carefully. What remains certain is that ancient Mesopotamians were already asking profound questions about human purpose, creation, mortality, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. The Atrahasis story becomes even stranger when the newly created humans do not immediately function perfectly within the world the gods have designed for them. The myth contains episodes involving human reproduction, population, divine intervention, and attempts to control the growing human population. Modern retellings sometimes transform these passages into a story about repeated genetic experiments, prototypes, and failed attempts to create a successful human species. Those descriptions sound remarkably similar to modern laboratory language, but that similarity comes from the way the ancient story is being translated and interpreted today. There is no archaeological evidence showing that Sumerian priests possessed genetic laboratories or understood DNA in the modern scientific sense. Still, the ancient creation stories are remarkable because they place the origin of humanity inside a deliberate process controlled by beings possessing knowledge far beyond ordinary humans. Then, centuries later, a completely different modern interpretation would transform these ancient gods into something far more controversial. During the 20th century, writer Zecharia Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were not merely divine beings, but extraterrestrial visitors who arrived on Earth from a distant planet called Nibiru. Sitchin proposed that Nibiru followed a vast orbit around the Sun, and that its inhabitants returned to Earth at intervals of roughly 3,600 years. He further claimed that these beings arrived hundreds of thousands of years ago to extract Earth's resources, particularly gold, and eventually created humans to serve as laborers. The theory became enormously popular because it appeared to connect ancient mythology with modern ideas about space travel, genetic engineering, and lost civilizations. But specialists in Sumerian and Akkadian languages reject Sitchin's translations and do not consider the ancient texts evidence for an extraterrestrial planet called Nibiru, in the way he described it. Yet the ancient tablets do contain something that makes the story difficult to dismiss entirely: descriptions of enormous disasters that affected human communities. Mesopotamian literature preserves traditions of catastrophic floods, destructive storms, famine, drought, warfare, and periods when entire kingdoms appeared to collapse under overwhelming pressure. Some texts also describe unusual celestial imagery, including darkened skies, frightening stars, disrupted landscapes, and rivers behaving in extraordinary ways. Ancient scribes naturally explained these events through the religious worldview of their time, often presenting disasters as consequences of divine decisions or cosmic disorder. Modern researchers, meanwhile, can compare archaeological evidence with sediments, climate records, and environmental data to determine whether some of those disasters corresponded to real historical events. The result is not proof of Nibiru, but it does reveal that ancient myths sometimes preserved memories of environmental and political catastrophes that genuinely happened. As researchers continued reconstructing Mesopotamian history, another document emerged that seemed even stranger than the creation stories: the Sumerian king list. Compiled and copied across different periods, the king list recorded rulers, cities, and lengths of reign, creating a legendary history that stretched backward toward the earliest days of kingship. At the beginning of the list, however, the numbers become extraordinary, with the legendary king Alulim assigned a reign of 28,800 years. Another early ruler, Dumuzid, is given an equally impossible reign of 36,000 years, while later rulers receive dramatically shorter but still legendary periods of rule. Scholars generally interpret these enormous numbers as part of a literary and political tradition designed to emphasize the ancient and divinely sanctioned nature of kingship. But when modern audiences encounter rulers supposedly governing for tens of thousands of years, it naturally raises the question of whether something else might be hidden beneath the numbers. That question eventually became fuel for theories suggesting that the earliest rulers were not entirely human, perhaps representing some form of divine human lineage. Ancient Mesopotamian kings did frequently connect their authority with the gods, using religious traditions to establish legitimacy and portray their rule as part of a cosmic order.